Welcome to Forsaken by Shadows, a production of stories by Sarah Danielle. This chapter is dedicated to my local library, which gathers and encourages fledgling authors like myself to keep writing. If you're wondering where to go next in your writing journey, check out your library and see what resources are there. Previously on Forsaken by Shadows, from Mazira's point of view. Styx announces that we are home, and all my trepidation returns. I had finally gotten used to the company around me, finally started to believe I could navigate it. But now we are about to enter a new unknown, and I am afraid again. I can't bring myself to rise when the others do, to go to the deck and view the gates Belnir praises. Risman stops to wait for me, and then, when I finally work up the courage to stand, he does something terrible. He tells me I'm beautiful. Of all the people in the world to say those words to me, why did it have to be Risman? Risman, who made me love him once and then burned me with it later. Risman, who said he didn't love me, but then treats me like he does. What am I supposed to think? What am I supposed to do? My heart is all tangled in knots, so I do the only thing I can think of. I run. I don't make it far. Once I get to the deck, I realize I have nowhere to go. The river current has picked up and the priest, Salarin, joins us. He warns us not to panic, and then the ride is on. The boat bucks wildly and we're forced to hunker down, and Risman, who I am still trying to avoid, holds me captive in his arms. I know he's just trying to keep me safe, but I still don't know what to think about him, and being trapped against his body is not helping with the thinking. Although before our eyes, the boat appears to be sailing over a waterfall, we find ourselves magically transported over the edge and into safe waters. We sail through the gates, adorned with statues of male and female drow, and find ourselves in a harbor, and I am shocked. Take away the cavern ceiling, and this town could have existed on the surface. There is music and noise and so many familiar things that it rips at my heart. When we dock, we disembark and I walk with Risman. I can tell he wants to take my hand, but I'm not ready yet. So I walk quickly and listen quietly as he converses with Beltal and Belnir, and then we're there, on the street, and people are everywhere, gawking at us and calling out their blessings. They want to know what happened, but Salarin and Torafane send them off. They say our first report goes to the Reverend Mother. We part way with the others, and even lose Torafane when he catches sight of his family in the crowd. Family. Not just a wife, but a daughter, and apparently a son, too. Salarin tells us he has a daughter as well. It's so hard to wrap my head around. Drow with a family that they love. But if it is true, and I have seen it with my eyes, then this sanctuary might actually be exactly what it claims. Forsaken by Shadows, Part 2, Where Silence Echoes. Chapter 13, First Impressions. The city of Lona, as Salarin told them it was officially named, was nothing compared to Menzoberranzan. The streets were narrower by far, the buildings carved from limestone rather than the more durable igneous alternatives. Light abounded in every direction, reflecting off the desaturated sedimentary in blazing orange shades. At best, this small community might have been scraped together in the lowest recesses of Menzoberranzan. It would have been home to the least fortunate in the city, a sector Risman might have strolled through as a shortcut to somewhere more grandiose. a place he'd forget he'd been if asked about it later. But that was before he'd sojourned in the wilds for 4 months, before the novelty of adventure had worn away and the strain of monotony had taken its toll, before silence ate away at his nerves and darkness bled his sanity dry. Compared to the stone-cold chambers and echoing nothingness, the sanctuary was magnificent. An actual city, sculpted in dark elven fashions, homes hewed from spires, lined with blue-toned fairy fire that warred with the orange glow, columns that were too cumbersome to remove, so they were chiseled into elegant works of art instead, rock walls bearing streaks of dolomite, chert, and in some places, the impression of bones from creatures long deceased. There were street corners and city blocks and glorious, chaotic civilization. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed it. And yet for every familiar turn of stone, the place was entirely alien as well. Strange designs sprouted between drow architecture like his mother's exotic mineral imports. Fire-like and sizzled from open windows, and fresh-baked spore bread wafted salivating aromas, but they were mingled with other scents, fragrances Risman didn't have words for. But Mazira did. He could tell by the way tears sparkled in her eyes whenever something particularly strange and pungent hit them. Not out of disgust, as she had shown for the tea, but rather a deep, undulating longing. He'd seen the same look every time she sang one of her surface songs for him. Not until he understood the longing in his own heart did he finally identify what he was seeing in hers. He felt it again, walking these streets. He wanted to pull Mazira close and put his arms around her, like he'd seen Torafane do to his wife. He wanted to whisper into her hair that it was going to be okay, that they really had found somewhere safe to belong. She had nothing to fear, and no reason to doubt. She need only look around for the proof. For while dark elves walked these drow-carved streets, they were by no means the only living creature here. There were elves of the surface, variations of the Swerfniblin, round-eared humans, and creatures half as tall as a man with bare, furry feet. Risman swore he even caught sight of a humanoid-sized cat who walked on 2 legs and wore a heavy apron. But that was absurd, and when he looked again, the creature was gone. He tried not to stare at first, but the strangers had no such qualms. They gaped openly at Risman and Mazira both, whispers following in their wake. In the beginning, it was unnerving, but after the first quarter hour, Risman grew numb to it. Besides, it wasn't like anyone could actually do anything to them. Not a single person carried a weapon larger than a belt knife, if they carried a blade at all. And while someone could be just as dangerous with their hands as they were with their sword, Risman seriously doubted all of these people were that capable. It was, so far as he was concerned, the very definition of suicidal. But he kept that thought to himself. Solarin moved them along at a leisurely pace, greeting all who hailed him with polite acknowledgement, while keeping up a stream of steady monologue in between. Facts, history, and any other tidbit the priest felt relevant washed over Risman like the river they left behind. It was just too hard to focus on words when there was so much else going on. There was the music, the lights, the noise of the people being people. And worst of all of it, there were children. Everywhere. Laughing, running, chasing each other through the streets, shrieking and singing, and unfortunately sometimes both at once. Risman couldn't remember at what age he'd been taught to be silent and unseen unless summoned. He distinctly remembered, however, what happened when he disobeyed those expectations. The lashes were probably still etched onto his back, though buried beneath a myriad of other sins he committed just by being born male. These children were obviously not held to the same standard. Then again, there were hardly any elders around to mind them. The adults that were present were busy doing other things, like menial chores and gawking at Risman as they walked by. This must be what Solarin meant when he said children were never normal. But while Risman fantasized about returning to the ever-silent Underdark just long enough to get the ringing out of his ears, he discovered children actually possessed one profound and redeeming quality. They made Mizira smile. Her forced neutrality couldn't withstand their silly antics. The more the children laughed and played around them, the softer her expression became. Her trembling ceased, her tension ebbed away, and before long, her lips twitched into one of her fleeting, genuine smiles, the kind he'd worked so hard for and never got enough of. The children could scream all they wanted, he decided, so long as they made Mizira happy. At some point, Torafane rejoined them. Risman hadn't quite been paying attention what had happened, and only noticed because Solarin's never-ending discourse suddenly faltered. One moment, they were three. The next, Torafane was simply striding in step with them, as though he'd never left. Except that he no longer carried his swords. Risman stared at his empty belt, trying to remember if he'd ever seen Torafane walk about unarmed. Was everyone in this city insane? It was a question he was left to mull over in silence as Solarin struck up a conversation with Torafane. They spoke in low voices, and though Risman probably could have eavesdropped if he made an effort, he didn't try. His focus was divided in too many directions. And then, at last, they turned a corner, and everything changed. The constricted streets opened up into an immaculate courtyard, and there, nestled in the center of it all, stood a gleaming black structure, the crown jewel of the city. This could only be the temple they were seeking. Nothing less than a deity would be worthy of it. It stood as one structure, carved into a collection of squared towers capped with jagged spires. Arched windows of colored glass decorated its facade, and even from this distance, Risman recognized intricate relief work adorning the frames. "This," Solarin said, with a grand gesture to all that was before them, "is our temple of Alistray. As I said, don't try to take it all in at once." Risman could only nod as Solarin nudged him forward. 24 columns of carved stone lined the pathway to the temple. Strings of golden lights zigzagged between the columns, washing out the orange light with warm white. There were crystal gardens, mushroom gardens, even a fountain that bubbled forth sparkling water, feeding gardens of real, verdant plant life. Among the different cloisters of mineral, stone, and fungi lounged small, furry creatures, which looked enough like the big exotic felines from the surface that Risman knew they were house cats. The very creatures that Mizira had been mockingly named for. They regarded him with silent, unblinking stares, and he didn't care for them. They only served to remind him how much he hated his brother. As the shock of the beauty wore away, Risman finally noticed the people. Unlike the cats, these had not jumped out at him as strange fixtures in the gardens, because for the first time since coming to Launa, he saw something that made sense. They were at a temple, and the temple was populated with drow women, and like proper drow, these women carried swords. Whether they wore elegant silks in the most undrowish colors, robes akin to the design Solarin wore, with the same strange eye pattern, or glimmering armor, which reflected the light in dangerous ways. Every one of them was adorned with a killing blade. The women regarded the party with the same unmoving stares as the cats, and made him just as uncomfortable. But unlike the people of the city, these song blades, as Risman assumed they were, focused their unnerving stares on Solarin. A few sly smiles touched their lips, and whispers hid behind hands. Lest Risman think he was imagining it, Solarin stiffened his posture, standing a little taller as he swept before them towards the temple. They reached the stairway that led to the massive double doors, which were open and inviting. On either side of the doors, however, stood an armored woman with a sword in hand. It must have been normal, though, for neither Torfane nor Solarin slowed their pace. Just as they reached the top of the stairs, one of the women spoke. "Mother is expecting you, Solarin," she said, without taking her eyes off the courtyard. A shadow of a smile graced her lips. "She's been cursing your name all cycle," the other woman added, in a high, airy voice. This one wasn't shy about her grin. "The council has already gathered. Good luck, song brother." "Marvelous," Solarin said, as dry as the stone at their feet. Then, with more feeling, he added, "Thank you." The women flourished their blades and then bowed low, as though inviting them into the temple. Mizira tugged him a little closer as they passed between the shining weapons clasped in black drow hands, a drop of sweat beading on her forehead. "It's going to be okay," Risman wanted to say, before realizing with a jolt that he wasn't so sure of that himself. As a boy, he'd been taught Lolth was always watching him through the eyes of her spiders. He didn't know what creature this Elistrea used as her eyes. Cats, maybe, judging by their continual presence. But the moment they crossed the threshold into her temple, he felt the weight of her presence like a mantle of lead. Or at least, he assumed it was her presence. But just because they were in her house didn't mean she was home. For all he knew, she wandered about like Lolth, catering to her more faithful followers and leaving the rest of them to beg and scrape. The weight he was feeling could merely be his own trepidation of the unknown, a feeling that only amplified as the thick aroma of incense and candle wax hit him like a gut punch. All at once, he was a little boy again, watching hearts get carved on an altar, fearing his would be next. Risman went numb, his heart pounding in his head like the drums of Lolth's faithful. This was a bad idea. He and Mizira should have stayed in the dark. It was Solarin's voice that cut through the moment. "Really? All cycle?" he huffed. "I haven't even been here. What has she to curse at while I'm away?" "I can't imagine," Torfane said, in a way that suggested otherwise. Solarin shot him a scathing look and swept forward. "This was as much your scheme as mine. She could at least curse your name as well." "Oh, I assure you, I have." The voice that spoke was rich and feminine, echoing off the walls of the vaulted vestibule. Risman tensed, glancing around for the source of the voice. The room they had entered was large and round, with 3 arched doorways leading out, aside from the double doors behind them. Ribbed columns carved from the black stone walls stretched to the ceiling, connecting together in a singular point high above their heads, where violet fairy fire danced around a chandelier of crystal. At the center of the vestibule was a round stone basin, filled to the brim with clear water. Beyond the basin, entering through the door straight ahead of them, was a woman who must have been the one to speak. If Risman had taken time to try and conjure an image of a reverend mother, she would have looked exactly as this woman appeared. Tall and lithe, the woman exuded regal authority. She wore a gown of scarlet dripping with silver beadwork. A jeweled headdress rested upon her loose, rolling waves of white hair, the metal filigree branching away from her face like lightning bolts frozen in time. Gold paint lined and dotted her crimson eyes, and a thick swath of it was painted down the center of her dark, full lips. She was otherworldly, and she wore a scowl that made Risman quiver. The woman strode forward until she reached the rim of the basin, placing her hands on the stone as she looked each of them up and down. "And I have cursed the name of the Doar twins, and Lena, and the Rivermaster greedy enough to take your gold and sail you into the wilds. And if you must know why, it is because I do not appreciate being made to worry over my recalcitrant children." Solarin and Torfane moved in unison, placing hands over heart and dipping low. "You grace us with your presence, Mother Lara," Solarin said. "And might I add, you are looking resplendent this cycle." Mother Lara raised a perfectly arched eyebrow. "Save your flattery, song brother. I am still cross with you." Despite her stern expression, Solarin's lips twitched as though he wanted to smile. He rose before the woman bid him rise, which would have earned Risman a smack with a whip from his mother had he done so in her presence, and ran a hand over the thick braid that hung over his shoulder. "I would apologize, dear mother, but I am afraid I cannot. As you can see, the Dark Maiden has blessed our hunt." Beside him, Torfane shifted, and if Risman didn't know him better, he would have thought it was out of concern. But nothing moved Torfane, not even dragon turtles. Emilara tapped her lacquered nails on the rim of the basin. "So I have seen, and so I have heard, though not for lack of trying. I am well aware you will not be returning my diamonds to Elestrea's treasury, and that Belmir Doar is limping home in dire need of a new set of adamantine. Be glad that I do worry, for had I not scried so much on your adventure, I would not have seen Mendroctovan in time to send Satara to your aid." "I assure you, we are most gracious," Solarin said, with another bow. "I will see that the diamonds are replaced." The woman heaved a heavy sigh, her shoulders relaxing. "You know that is the least of my concerns," she said. "Your exploits proved as dangerous and deadly as I feared, and I do not deny that I regretted allowing you to go at all." Solarin frowned, opening his mouth to say something else, but the woman raised a hand and silenced him. "Yet," she continued, "I have never, in all my life, been more pleased to be proven wrong." Her eyes flicked to Risman, then to Mizira, then to their joined hands. Her stone expression blossomed into a radiant smile before she returned her attention to Solarin. "May the Dark Maiden reward your obstinacy so I don't have to." Solarin's smile was all self-satisfaction, another expression that would have earned Risman a beating. "You honor us with your praise," he said, only a touch sarcastically. "May I present our new voices?" "Not yet. The council is waiting, unless you desire a moment to recover yourselves first." Once more, her gaze fell on Risman and Mizira, as did Torfane's and Solarin's, as though the decision was theirs to make, and not the reverend mother's. Feeling pinned to the wall, Risman shrugged. He wasn't sure that his voice had followed him into the temple. "Let's just move on to the council," Solarin offered. "We may take a proper rest when it is done." Mother Laura nodded. "This way, then." She left the vestibule through the same door she had come in through, and Solarin gestured for them to follow. He himself stayed at the basin of water, dipping 2 fingers into the liquid and then pressing them to his forehead. Risman didn't catch the words he murmured, but they sounded elvish. He hastened to follow Torfane into the next room. Having grown up in a religious home, Risman was fairly used to the layout of a house of worship, so he knew exactly what chamber they had just entered, even without the spider-shaped altar at the front of the room. Or any altar, for that matter. Yet this was most certainly the sanctuary of the temple. Cavernous and round, There were rows upon rows of stone benches, all angled towards a central focal point. A towering statue of a woman clad only in her ankle-length hair. The detail was so fine and perfect, Risman averted his gaze, fearing the image of this supposed goddess might spring to life and step right off the pedestal and punish him for, well, anything, really. Whatever whim or fancy struck her to punish him for, as the gods were oft to do. He had seen enough of her alluring marble features to recognize a likeness to the idols of Lolth. He only looked again because Mizira suddenly tugged on his hand. "Risman," she whispered, and there was urgency in her voice. He glanced at her, then followed her wide-eyed gaze back to the face of the statue, fearing he was right about it coming to life. But the goddess stayed stiff and still, merely an image made of the deity she represented. "I've seen her before," Mizira said. There was reverence in her voice that sent chills down Risman's spine. Risman dropped his gaze to the feet of the idol, where a real, living woman sat, strumming a series of strings stretched taut between a wooden frame. Each pluck sent a note of shimmering beauty throughout the chamber. Music unlike anything he'd heard before, but it did little to quiet his nerves. "What do you mean?" he asked, daring to look again. Well, the statue did look like Lolth, and Mizira had spent an awful lot of time polishing idols at House Tyr to know it. "I can't explain it. I just know her." And then she suddenly squeaked, her cry cutting sharply through the music and incense. Emilara and Torafane spun, and Risman's hand reached instinctively for weapons he didn't carry, but there were no monsters or demon goddesses leaping from the shadows. There was only a gray cat, which had sprung up onto the bench they were passing. Mizira stood with her hand clutched to her heart, staring at the beast with wide, startled eyes, her chest heaving. When she realized everyone was staring at her face burned as red as Mother Lara's dress, and tears sparkled in her eyes. "I'm sorry. It startled me." She buried her face in her hands. "It's quite all right, child," Solaran said, standing just behind them. "They do have a bad habit of appearing out of nowhere, but you will get used to it. Cats are sacred to Elestrea." The cat, oblivious to the distress it caused, made a rumbling sound in its throat and reared back on its hind legs, pawing for Mizira. "But that's no excuse," Mother Lara said sharply, and for an enraging second Risman thought she was talking to Mizira. He whipped his head in her direction, ready to lash out no matter how powerful of a matron she was, only to find her glowering at the cat. "Silverpaw, you should apologize for scaring our guest." Silverpaw? The animal had a name? The cat merely rolled onto its back, its rumbling growing so loud Risman thought the whole creature was vibrating. It kept its luminous eyes on Mizira and made a strange little chirping sound. Mizira peered at it through her fingers, and to Risman's grudging delight, she smiled at it. The tiny monstrosity didn't deserve it. "May I touch it?" she asked, a question which surprised Risman more than the initial outburst, both that she asked it at all and that she desired to touch it. The thing probably had diseases. "I think she would enjoy that," Mother Lara said. "I believe she is asking to be held." To Risman's abject horror, Mizira reached out and scooped the creature into her arms, and it rumbled all the more, rubbing its face against hers. Mizira's smile grew wider, and she glanced at Risman as though wanting to share the joy with him. "She'll stay with you as long as you want her," Mother Lara said, saving Risman from having to feign a smile. She turned and continued down the aisle towards the statue, and they all went along, with Mizira still holding the cat and rubbing its ears. which meant she no longer had a hand free to hold Risman's. Was it petty to be jealous of a cat? Probably, but that didn't stop him from seething quietly. They passed under the shadow of the statue, past the woman who strummed her instrument, and moved towards another pointed archway to the left of the idol. Risman held his breath until they were through the door, thankful to be away from the oppressive reverence. Yet this new room gave no relief to his nerves. It was another vaulted chamber, though significantly smaller than the ones he had been led through previously. Lit sconces along the wall illuminated the dark almost painfully, forcing him to squint to see the rest. They had come into a meeting hall, and they were no longer alone. 2 long tables stretched before him, flanking a simple yet elegant arched throne. The table to his right was full, with 6 people staring curiously in his direction. The other table held 5 and an empty seat. Behind the table was a wall of gallery seating, in which a dozen more people sat. The murmurs of conversation hushed when they entered, and everyone rose to their feet at once. They followed Emilara to the center of the room, then Solarin placed a hand on Risman's shoulder to halt him there. The Reverend Mother continued on, and stood before the throne, turning to face them. "Friends," she called, addressing the room at large. "We've gathered to witness the receiving of new voices into our song. Let us lift our voices to Alestrea for her wisdom in these matters." Then she closed her eyes and began to sing. All around them, voices joined her, raising a lyrical prayer in Elvish to the goddess Risman had been glad to avoid. He fidgeted, trying to look anywhere but at someone directly, wishing this ritual would end. Solarin's voice joined in right away, which was no real shock, but when Toraphane's low growl caught up the words, Risman had to work hard to keep his jaw from hitting the floor. He'd said everyone sang. He didn't say that he sang. Finally, the prayer ended. Mother Lara took her seat and there was rustling as others followed suit. "Now then," the Reverend Mother said, "let us commence. Brother Zovar, will you be taking your seat on the council?" Solarin stepped forward. "Given the nature of this event and my personal bias involved, I choose to stand before the council as a servant of Alestre and nothing more." He was on the council? Well, that did surprise Risman. In fact, now that he looked, he saw what he hadn't seen before. Half of the council members, assuming that was who the people at the tables were, and Solarin were to be counted among them, were male. The females only held the majority if Mother Laura was counted among them. What strange place had they come to? Emilara's expression remained neutral. "You understand, of course, that by ceding your seat for this meeting, your voice will not be counted should a vote be called for?" "I understand," Solarin replied. "Good. Then proceed with the trial." "Trial?" Risman shot Solarin a sideways glance, but the priest wasn't looking at him. He glanced at Toraphane next, who gave him an almost imperceptible shake of the head. "Don't react." "Sure, fine, but no one said anything about a trial." Beside him, Mizira was tension and unease, her arms still curled around the cat. The creature was no longer rumbling, but watching the council with ears flicked forward, as if interested in the proceedings. "Council and conductors," Solarin began, all congenial formality. "As you know, I set out on a journey 3 cycles ago with the company of Toraphane Zeren and the Dawar family. I was prompted by a vision received by our goddess as I tended to the chapel during my shift of worship." There were nods among the watchers, as if this was all old news to them. Based on the description given to us by Torafane when he returned from his tour, I believe the woman in my vision to be the lost captive of House Tyr. With the... He hesitated, raising an eyebrow at Emilara. With the blessing of our Reverend Mother, we set out to see if there was any substance to my vision. Emilara narrowed her eyes ever so slightly, but she didn't interrupt. As I stand before you now, I am pleased to present to you the fruit of our efforts. Solarin stepped back and gestured to Rizman and Mazira. This is Rizman, second son of House Tyr, fifth house of Menzoberranzan, now fugitive of the city. Though the attention was mortifying, Rizman wasn't at all displeased by his introduction. Fugitive of Menzoberranzan had a nice ring to it, like a badge of honor. And this, Solarin's tone took on a grandiose nature, is the young woman who called to me, Mazira Zilveris of Faerun. I have witnessed with my own eyes she has been called by Elistrea to touch the weave. The statement sent a ripple of murmurs through the gathered crowd, and some craned to get a better look at them. Even Emilara leaned forward with interest. "Is this true?" she said, addressing her question to Torafane. "I am not skilled in the knowledge of the arcane," Torafane replied. "However, someone cast magic while our cleric was busy with other spells. If Solarin says it is, I believe him." That was apparently good enough. Emilara leaned back. "How wonderful! Elistrea grants so few the magic of the weave. You have been given a precious gift, child, and we are honored by your presence." Mazira trembled at his side, holding the cat a little tighter. It rumbled again and rubbed her face with its own, as though telling her it was all okay. The very words Rizman wanted to say. This cat needed to go. But Rizman seemed to be the only one who felt that way. Mother Lara raised her hand and silence fell once more. "Tell us of your journey. We are all curious to know the details of what transpired." At this, Solarin stepped back and Torafane stepped forward. The commander recited the account of their travels in succinct anecdotes, a perfect military report. He left nothing out and added no commentary. It was simply the facts. Emilara's face didn't betray any expression, though not everyone remained so calm. Several gasped in shock when Torafane told of the dragon turtle's attack, and even more when he got to the part where Belnir died. When he revealed that Belnir had been revived, several called out congratulatory remarks to Solarin for the part he played in the resurrection. The priest, who had seemed so unflappable, shifted awkwardly and deferred all praise to Elistrea. And then Torafane was finished, stepping back beside Rizman. Mother Lara contemplated them for a moment, her nails tapping the arm of her throne. "The maiden's mother fights hard for you," she said, finally, a phrase that Rizman didn't understand. She looked and sounded troubled, and there was a collective hiss from the audience. Then she shook the expression away and straightened. "You were injured when you were found," she said, her gaze fixed on Rizman. "Why?" The blunt question caught him off guard. Rizman hadn't expected to be addressed at all, after so long of not being required to give an answer to anything. He glanced around nervously, but only found expectant eyes on him. "My brother," he said at last. He wasn't sure where to anchor his eyes. "He had tracked us and attacked." "And you defeated him?" Mother Lara pressed. "No, we only escaped because of Mazira's magic." Again, the murmurs rippled through the gallery. At his side, Mazira leaned closer, their arms brushing, as though she were lending him her strength. It was enough. "We were on a ledge," he added to fill the silence, "and we jumped into the river." I lost consciousness, but Mizira was awake. She kept us alive and hid us in a cavern where we were eventually found. I do not know what became of of him." "I see," Mother Lara said, and her expression was troubled again. "And what do you regret about leaving home?" "What?" Risman stiffened, unsure that he heard the question right. He glanced sidelong at Torfane, but found no help from him this time. Solarin's expression remained just as impassive. No one spoke. No one seemed to breathe, as though they were all collectively waiting on his answer. Risman's fingers twitched for the hilt of the blade he didn't actually possess. It was a nervous tick, and he idly wondered how long it would be before he could rearm himself. But now he was letting his mind wander to avoid the question, and Mother Lara was still waiting for an answer. He took a breath, thinking of the long evernights of hunger and thirst, the constant fatigue and fear, the fights with Mizira and the goblins who raided them. Teloriel's attack, the agonizing pain of hitting the river. Everything about his sojourn in the Underdark had been misery. He'd hated every moment and longed for the surface above with every breath. But as he stood there, contemplating, he couldn't think of a single regret he held, save for one. "The only thing I'd regret about leaving home is not doing so sooner." The collective breath released, and Emilara actually smiled. "Well spoken," she said, and Risman hated that her comment pleased him. She turned to the men and women on her right and left. "Well, I think I've heard enough. Your stories and the testimony of your guide have already been made known to us, and do not bear repeating. Council, do you have any questions for the candidates?" Heads shook and voices muttered some variation of no. "Then let us appoint conductors and conclude this trial." Risman breathed his own sigh of relief. He had passed the test he didn't know he was taking. Mizira's smallest finger looped around his, and he glanced at her, surprised. The cat had somehow managed to drape itself around her shoulders like a live fur collar, rumbling loudly again. He had to admit, it was kind of a pleasant, comforting sound. He squeezed her finger and focused forward, waiting for the pronouncement of his future. "I will not ask who will stand for Risman and Mizira," Emilara declared, a statement which sent whispers cascading around the gallery. "That is normally our custom, but this circumstance is unique. Instead, I have already decided who I shall appoint. Solarin, will you accept the honor of conducting these new voices into our song?" "Me?" Solarin blinked, looking around as if surprised to be noticed. "But I'm not qualified." "On the contrary, I think you are more than up to the task." Mother Lara leaned back in her chair, her eyes glinting. "You've raised your daughter into a fine young lady, and you counsel more of our citizens than any of our other songblades. And, as you have reminded us, Alistrea gave you the vision." For once, the priest seemed to have nothing to say. He gazed around at the faces of the watchers, which showed a growing amount of approval, several heads nodding encouragingly. He glanced at Risman, then at Mizira, and then at the cat who draped around her shoulders. It, too, seemed to be spurring him on, urging him to make his choice. Finally, he nodded, stepping forward and bowing his head. "As the Dark Maiden leads, so I will follow. I accept the honor." Thank you for listening to this episode of Forsaken by Shadows, written and produced by me, Sarah Danielle. The music and ambiance for this production have been provided by Tabletop Audio and Pixabay. Forsaken by Shadows is unofficial fan content not endorsed by Wizards of the Coast. Risman and Mizira have passed the test and have been welcomed into the sanctuary. What will life be like living with the priest? Subscribe to follow along and find out.